First tonight, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he's dissolving the country's war cabinet. It follows the departure from government last week of two key centrist war cabinet members and pressure from a far-right minister for a place in the cabinet. Correspondents say this move has been on the cards ever since the former General Benny Gantz quit the war cabinet last week, along with cabinet observer Gadi Eisenkot. They both condemned Mr. Netanyahu's failure to commit to a post-war plan for Gaza. Their departure fueled efforts by the far-right security minister Itamar Ben-Gvir to be included in the war cabinet, a move which analysts say would have intensified strains with international allies, including the US. So Mr. Netanyahu has now dissolved the war cabinet and will now reportedly make crucial decisions about the war in small ad hoc meetings. Well, the main UN agency in Gaza says the limited daily pause in military activity announced by the Israeli army has yet to make any practical difference. A spokesman for UNRWA is quoted as saying that law and order conditions have not allowed aid workers to take advantage of the move. The tactical pause to allow the delivery of humanitarian supplies into southern Gaza applies to a road from a crossing controlled by Israel, but the Israeli military argues that the UN is yet to take advantage of that protected road to deliver aid.
This new initiative, which began on Saturday, allows international organizations to move on the route without having to first coordinate. This gives them greater flexibility, and we hope to see it increase the amount of aid making its way to the humanitarian zone. So far, we haven't seen the UN take full advantage of this step.
This tactical pause is one of the ways that we're solving the problem of distribution, and we're urging again the international organizations to do their job and to make sure that this stuff that are outside here will be distributed to the people of Gaza.
Well, for more on all this, I'm joined now on the line from Tel Aviv by Arise special correspondent Carl Bostic. Good to see you, Carl. So tell us, first of all, why Mr. Netanyahu has dissolved the war cabinet and why now?
That's right, Charles. As you correctly said, after Benny Gantz resigned and then Gadi Eisenkot, both members of an opposition party, the National Unity Party. Charles, you need to keep in mind this. After October 7th happened, the worst day in Israel's history, they formed a war cabinet, which would also include opposition members. That was Benny Gantz, that was Gadi Eisenkot from an opposition party. And they were also valued because they are both former military chiefs of staff. So they have a lot of military experience. Yet, Charles, after more than 8 months of war, we're going to the 9th month already, they became very disenchanted because it became increasingly clear, Benny Gantz saying essentially that Netanyahu was putting his own political survival ahead of the interests of the country. And by that, I'm saying that people felt that the government was prioritizing Netanyahu being beholden to far-right ministers in his cabinet, which keep him in power. It's a coalition government, Charles. And yet, repeatedly, Benny Gantz was in favor of any hostage ceasefire deal. That has not happened yet, Charles. And despite dramatic rescue of 4 Israeli hostages 2 Saturdays ago, after 8 months, Charles, what do you have to show for that? 7 Israeli hostages rescued after 8 months of war. 105 were released in November through a hostage deal. So now what you have, Charles, is a situation, as you correctly said, that he's basically taken the war cabinet out of the mix because Itamar Ben-Gvir, he, as national security minister, expected a seat in that war cabinet. Well, that's not going to happen now. So now, as you correctly say, Charles, these will be ad hoc decisions made by Netanyahu. To be honest, Charles, what this means is that the Rafah campaign will continue as it is. And as also, you referenced, we've got a second front now that's intensifying. This is the front against Hezbollah in northern Israel on the Lebanon border. It's escalating. It's on the brink of escalation. Charles, it's a summer of discontent here in Israel, where I am, and it's a summer of, quite frankly, growing war drums on the north. We could looking at a lot more serious, warfare happening. But now with a situation where Netanyahu makes all the decisions, and quite honestly, the final point I make is this, Charles. One reason why Benny Gantz was attractive because the West liked him. He traveled to Washington, met Kamala Harris, the vice president. He met Jake Sullivan, security advisor. He traveled to the UK, all without Netanyahu's approval. And now that face of moderation has been removed. And now we're looking at really an unvarnished Netanyahu making very tough decisions about how to carry out the war.
And you mentioned there, Carl, that decisions will be made ad hoc in collaboration with other key allies, but then you also suggested that Benjamin Netanyahu was going to be making all the war decisions himself. I mean, is there a kind of middle of the road here to decision making, or is he essentially going to be absolutely in charge of all of it?
Charles, this really kind of vindicates or confirms what Gantz was saying, that that Netanyahu is more preoccupied and concerned about his own political survival than the interest of the country. The latest poll that came out this week, Charles, following the resignation of Benny Gantz, was that in the Mariv newspaper, was that Gantz was considered to be more suitable, more fit to be the leader of Israel than Netanyahu by a margin of 42% to 35%. So that's quite frankly how people feel. That said, there's no way to really change the existing reality here, Charles. You now got daily protests going on, Charles, for this week, calling for a ceasefire, calling for a release of the hostages, and perhaps most importantly, calling for new elections. The last part, not likely to happen anytime soon. Charles, we're weeks away from Benjamin Netanyahu making a visit to Washington, D.C. in the U.S., addressing both houses of Congress under a real cloud of uncertainty. When he arrives in Washington end of July, it's even unclear if there will be a ceasefire deal. It's even unclear if any more hostages will be released, and it's perhaps even more likely that the ground is being now set for war against Hezbollah and on the Lebanon border. Finally, I'll say they are embarking on a PR type campaign. They're saying that within about 2 weeks, they'll have operational control of Rafah. What that means is that they're saying that Rafah was the last bastion of Hamas battalions, and that they've now taken control of it. They've identified, dozens and dozens of tunnel shafts leading into Egypt, which could have been used as smuggling routes for arms, fighters, and even to smuggle out leaders and hostages. So they're in control of that. They say in 2 weeks' time, they'll have almost full operational control. But what happens after that, Charles? No one really knows. And that's the problem right there. And finally, you mentioned the aid now coming back into Gaza, that tactical pause. They've got a backlog of 1,000 trucks, Charles, 1,000 trucks. And that still may not be enough to make a difference, because the UN is saying that right now more than half of the 2 million population of Gaza is on the brink of famine. Gaza, you remember, Charles, it's only a quarter of the size of Abuja, but you're talking 2 million people.
Well, that brings me to that military tactical pause, which has prompted so much political reaction. I mean, given the amount of pushback it's generated, is it still going ahead?
The military, yes. I mean, give you an example of just how deadly it is, Charles. This past weekend was maybe the deadliest in the whole military, excuse me, offensive, because you had a dozen Israeli soldiers killed, either by IEDs, booby traps, or whatever. What we're looking at, Charles, is this. Even when Israel says they have operational control, that does not end the guerrilla war environment, because what they can do is, they still got this stockpile of rockets or explosives that they can use to ambush Israeli troops. One journal even saying, Charles, I was almost surprised to read it, where he's saying that you know, in terms of clearing out Gaza, because Hamas has had 15, 16 years to embed itself in the Gaza population. We let a weed turn into a forest. That's what he's saying. And what that suggests is that there will be some sort of presence for the IDF, the Israeli military, to go in and out of Gaza, to be inside Gaza for the next 1 to 3 years, to be honest.
Well, I was curious to know, Carl, and I guess our listeners, viewers are as well, whether that military tactical pause, which the Israelis say is going ahead, but which the UNRWA and a lot of other people say they're not seeing any signs that it is going ahead. We need to know whether it is in fact going ahead. What are you hearing?
Well, again, a lot of it is still hard to process because, Charles, let's keep in mind that this is now the beginning of Eid. Eid just began yesterday. So, if anything, it was a gesture to recognize the importance of Eid to the population there, over an 11-hour period. So, who knows how long this tactical pause will last? It may only be a week. It may only be until Eid plays out. But meanwhile, you've got a backlog of 1,000 trucks. And then really crucially, Charles, the problem has always been distribution. You get those trucks in, they get to the warehouse, but then how do you distribute it? Because right now, it looks like Hamas still is in control of distributing that aid. And that's why a lot of analysts here, Charles, are saying this. You know something? The priority is get the hostages out, recognize that Hamas is going to be here to stay, and we need to go back maybe for another war much later. And in the meantime, let's facilitate the humanitarian needs on the ground. Because what's reality also is this, Charles, Israel cannot ignore how it's become isolated and a pariah internationally, boxing the U.S. into a corner. So they need to show this kind of good faith. In fact, one final thing, Charles, I'll say is this. They say that, you're speaking to so many different audiences. Like Benjamin Netanyahu told the Hebrew press here in Israel that he was not aware of this tactical pause. It caught him by surprise because he wanted to deflect criticism from the right-wing extremists. But he was saying to English language type people in the press and Western governments is that, well, this is for the good of the people in Gaza, suggesting also because it's Eid. So my point is, and as one analyst said, he is wearing different masks for different audiences. And that's what's happening here because you have to kind of figure out, well, which audience is he talking to and which mask is he wearing?
Indeed. Carl, thank you very much indeed. Carl Bostic is our special correspondent. He's talking to me there from Tel Aviv. And the upshot of the points he's making, essentially, is that there's a lot of pressure on Mr. Netanyahu, both domestically and internationally. Very complicated for him, apparently, with a split cabinet, problems with the army, a large number of Israelis calling for a deal to go ahead to get the hostages released, and on the international scene, disagreements with the US. Carl Bostic talking to me there from Tel Aviv.